So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of EU and Me, which is our first episode of this incredible new series. Basically, it's going to be a bit of a completion to what Arbury Road does. We will have every week a brief commentary made by me and Dermot on the most recent news at the European level. And then every week we will have a guest talking about a particular topic of relevance for the European Union and for what Arbury Road does for our agenda. Who we have today, Dermot?
So, first up today, probably the country that's been the most controversial country in the last few months and maybe years in the EU, which is Hungary, who have had quite a few controversies this week and, well, over the last week. So, first of all, we can talk about the most recent, which happened a couple of days ago, was a member of the European Parliament for Hungary, obviously, made comments which I have in front of me here that I'm going to read out to you. It relates to the rule of law and the ongoing argument between Poland and Hungary regarding the recovery fund. Now, as we all know, Poland and Hungary have vetoed the recovery fund because they don't want the rule of law to be relevant in the allocation of funds. This obviously goes against a core belief of the EU, and the battle is ongoing. So, one Hungarian MEP named Tamás Deutsch made the comment saying that, so after the EU stated that Poland and Hungary should have nothing to fear from the rule of law, because obviously if you respect the rule of law, why would you fear a rule of law stipulation on the recovery fund? To which Deutsch responded that it is just like, he said, if you have nothing to hide, you don't need to be afraid. I well remember that the Gestapo and the AVH, which were the Hungarian secret police in the communism era, had the same motto. That's what they said. It's like the historical experience of those living in Germany and Hungary at the time when they had they had fears who had nothing to cover up. So, naturally, this is an absolutely outrageous comment to make. Paco, would you agree?
Yeah, it is a really, I think, big problem that has been, not only Hungary but Poland, like these governments which are going in a illiberal direction, definitely for the past years. I think it opens the broader question, which is about the EU and the relationship with the single member states. I would like, for example, if you think about the Corona, at the recovery fund and the Corona crisis, it's like the EU shouldn't let, in my opinion, these single states create a problem and veto something as important as the recovery fund. So I think it opens really a discussion. Both Poland and Hungary committed to respect the rule of law when they entered the European Union. So that is a essential commitment.
It's a core principle of the Union, absolutely.
Exactly. So I think it's really time to find a way that doesn't involve unanimity for the EU to progress and to take action.
Maybe a qualified majority.
A qualified majority is going
you
to
could have
explain perhaps what.
Yeah. So one method so at the moment, if you want to pass legislation in the EU, you need unanimity, as you said. If one country vetoes, you cannot continue with the proposal. Hungary and Poland have created this alliance, let's say, whereby it's clear that both ruling governments are not interested in the rule of law. Both ruling governments aren't interested in equality. In some ways, they're not even interested in democracy. They're interested in power, and in some cases, authoritarian power, totalitarian power, which is how they've been acting. Now, what a qualified majority would be, for one of the examples that was proposed, would be, say, 65 or even 55% of the member states, as long as it made up over 65% of the total European population, should be enough to get something passed. Yeah. Now, there could be arguments made against that system as well, but to me it seems far superior to the unanimity idea, because what's happened with Hungary and Poland is that the EU had the view that as soon as someone enters the EU, the only way is forward. The only thing that's going to happen is progress, and we've seen that that's not the case. Both Hungary and Poland, Hungary in particular, have taken a massive step back, away from democracy, away from the rule of law, away from equality, and that can't continue. We're caught in a deadlock at the moment, and yeah, these controversies we've seen over the last week in Hungary they're going to go punish now. They're slipping up. They thought they could get away with acting in personal interests, but now their members are starting to make mistakes, and they're going to be caught on those mistakes, and they're going to be scrutinized for those mistakes.
Mistakes and orgies.
Mistakes and orgies, as you say. That leads us nicely on to the next topic, which relates to another Fidesz member. Fidesz, of course, are the ruling party of Viktor Orbán in Hungary. His name is József Scheyer, and on Sunday he resigned as an MEP after being caught by police scaling down a building, leaving what has been described as a sex party with mostly men in attendance. And when the police reprimanded him, he was also caught with ecstasy pills in his bag. Yeah. Now, of course, the ecstasy pills weren't his. He doesn't know how they got there. He wasn't involved in any of the sex of the party. And it's not only an outrageous scandal, of course, because it broke lockdown regulations. I mean, a member of the European Parliament breaking lockdown regulations in Brussels, going to a party with too many people above a cafe in the middle of the city centre. But more than that, it just shows the hypocrisy of some of these members of Fidesz, because this man, Scheyer, has been vocally anti-LGBTI in the past. And yet here he is showing up at what has been described as a mostly male orgy.
Yeah, to be fair, this doesn't surprise me too much, like in the sense that is often the case. Like it's often these people who are, the most like against LGBT, but in general, the less liberal the people are, the more they end up being actually hiding something in their private life, so what really, I think, disconnects us with the sort of hypocrisy which in general is in this sort of new right-wing, extreme right, I would define, reactionary and sovereignist movements, where, like the same, you have hypocrisy in your private life, which is an hypocrisy also in the receipts you sell to people, like the solutions you sell to people, which are, I think most of these people are not stupid. They know these solutions won't work. They know Hungary cannot be alone, cannot solve the problems of the Hungarian population alone. They know that you need a European Union, and yet they keep on talking about going back to the nation state when they perfectly know this solution is not valuable.
Yeah, exactly. They want Hungary and Poland at the moment, particularly Hungary again. They want their complete national sovereignty. They want to build their country using European funds. They don't want to engage in European principles, and they don't want to uphold those principles that are really the basis for the entire European Union. A third controversial story that came out about Hungary this week relates to the Hungarian-born US financier George Soros, who I'm sure most of us are already familiar with. And it comes from a Hungarian government cultural commissioner, who's also the head of a museum, said that, and I quote here, "Europe has become George Soros's gas chamber, and poisonous gas flows from the capsule of a multicultural open society which is deadly for the European way of life." Now, for those of you who don't know too much about George Soros, he's also a Holocaust survivor. And these comments, he also went on, the man in question's name is Szilárd Demeter, and he also went on to add that, directly comparing Soros to Hitler in this sentence, he accused him of being a liberal Führer whose Liber-Aryan army deifies him more than Hitler's own did. This transcends political incorrectness. This is a man who's in a position of power in his country. He's a cultural figure. He leads a museum, and he compared a Holocaust survivor to Adolf Hitler. It's as deplorable as you could ever imagine.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this kind of metaphor comparing the EU to Hitler is not new, because, there were a lot also in the Brexit campaign, association between even Merkel and Hitler, with no sense at all. Again, I think all this brings us, because now we are talking about Hungary, Poland, as if it was a separate problem, but actually something that is, this sort of reactionary and extremist, we could even arrive to call them proto-fascist, so they have something in common for sure with the old fascist or authoritarian movements. they are originating in every country. You know, like I'm Italian. We have Salvini. We have seen Le Pen in France was actually arrived to the ballot, the final ballot, and risk to. So I think while the problem is really bad, like in Poland, in Hungary, probably in this moment, but it's like a European answer we need to give, and it's a problem that every European state should really face, and but also the European Union should really try to solve this problem as coordinated. And I think part of the solution is what I think, as at least this is the vision I think of Arbury Road is like to try to go back speaking, because you know these people have like I think in the especially popular strata they have a big following, like they have a lot of followers. They have, so I think the solution is trying to go back and talk with people and sell a new vision of the European Union, sell a new model. Like clearly the European Union has its own faults, and like the answer is not to keep on pretending these movements don't exist or to say people are stupid, people don't understand, but go back to understand our own mistakes and try to find a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head there, and it's that the EU was lauded at first as being this great progressive union, and in some ways it was. Europe has been peaceful for decades, which was really what we needed more than anything. You have an economic union, but unfortunately that economic union was formed and advanced and continues to advance without the political union that really should be the basis for everything. And as you say, it's time we can talk about these issues until the cows come home, but it's time for some action, and there needs to be pan-European action.
Yeah, because actually we are seeing the consequences of, and this brings us to the second topic we will treat today, like in terms of the last week news, which is racism. And you know, of course, when you have years and years of these people talking about national sovereignty, talking about being Hungarian, being Polish, being Italian, almost as a race.
Yeah.
So this really drives back us to the sort of interwar period, sort of ultra-nationalism. But this, of course, will generate episodes of racism. Like at the beginning, they are just words, but they escalate rapidly into, unfortunately, into violence. And we have seen that we have had several episodes. There was one in France, which has become viral in Europe because there was this black guy beaten by the police. Now, I think there is this perception a little bit between among Europeans to be fortunate, like if compared to, for example, the US, where phenomena of racism are more frequent, and all the sort of Black Lives Matter campaign seems almost as doesn't concern us. In fact, like we see, like there are several episodes also in Europe, and I think we should have our own version of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea, because as you've said there, as soon as people start to talk about racism in Europe, the immediate comparison is the United States. Now, the institutional deep-rooted racism in the United States, it can't be compared to Europe, and it shouldn't be compared to Europe, because it's a very different it comes in a very different historical context. You know, the history of slaves being so prominent in U.S. history, and the racial division in America continues to this day. Now, make no mistake, we have a massive issue with racism here in Europe as well, and I'm glad you brought up that incident of the Frenchman. I think he was a music producer. Police reprimanded him for supposedly not wearing a mask. They went inside, he walked into his music studio, or they escorted him into his music studio, and there's video evidence of them beating him for 15 minutes. Now, that is horrible at the best of times, but what makes it even more controversial is that came in the same week, late last week, just a day or two after the French government proposed to ban the ability for members of the public to video officers when they're in uniform. Now, so on the one side there, you've got the French government saying, all right, we need to protect our police officers from being videoed. And less than 24 hours later, you have video evidence coming out of policemen brutally beating a man for 15 minutes. Yeah. Now, it's not just France. We know France does struggle with issues of racism, but this is absolutely by no means limited to France. And I'd like to mention Portugal for a moment. because over the last year, I guess, really since last October, when as you were saying, these issues start is that it becomes the normalization of racist rhetoric is how a lot of these things start. You saw it with Trump, we saw it during the Brexit campaign with relation to migration, and now in Spain we saw it with Vox last year. The representation of the far right in Europe is growing. Their leaders are getting seats in parliament and they're having a say politically. And that man in Portugal's name is André Ventura. Now he got into parliament last October, and since then we have seen a massive increase in both death threats and acts of violence committed towards activists, committed towards academics, committed towards anyone who speaks out against the far right or in favor of racial equality. Now, with some examples I have here were you had 2 Brazilian women were attacked outside a police station, were attacked by the police, outside a club in Cape Verdean. Sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. You had a football player for the team Porto, one of the biggest teams in Portugal, walked off the pitch. His name is Musa Marega, born in Mali, and he abandoned the game after fans were shouting racial slurs. There were also a black woman and her daughter assaulted because they didn't have a bus ticket. And these incidents were rising and rising throughout the year until last July, just a few months ago, an actor named Bruno Cande was murdered, having been shot 4 times. Now, this murder has been described by ENAR, which is the European Network Against Racism, as purely racially motivated. The sad thing is, as we say, we had the issues in France, now we're talking about the issues in Portugal. These issues are cropping up in every single country around the EU. This racism is not a problem for the United States. It is also a massive issue here at home.
Definitely, and let's not forget also the incidents in which sort of anticipated all of these in Greece, like with Golden Dawn. So it's actually a problem which is has begun I would say in the early 2000s and is going.
Well, it was never not a problem. You know, the fortunate or unfortunate thing that happened, if depending on which way you look at it, is that all the attention has been on the United States, particularly in Western Europe. We see how prevalent the racial divide is over there, and we think, oh well, at least it's not like that here. We absolutely struggle with these same issues on the continent.
Definitely, and the Arbury Road will actually dedicate a podcast one of the next weeks to racism.
Yeah,
we will have a couple of experts.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talking about this, so follow us, and I think it's a team that really needs to be treated. Now let's close with the positive news, just to bring a bit.
Why not?
Exactly. Which was it's now about 10 days old, but is that in Scotland for the first time, absorbent and
so tampons and sanitary pads, yeah.
Sanitary pads are going to be free for the first time for everyone, and available in pharmacies.
In pharmacies, in youth centres. They had them. They previously in 2018 they made them freely available in universities, schools, and colleges. But this has now been expanded to youth centres, pharmacies, and other points of sale of these products, which is absolutely fantastic.
So really well done to the Scottish friends, and we really hope as Arbury Road that these will become the normality across all the European Union. I think every state should abolish what is called the so-called tampon tax, because in the end it ends up being a tax on women and a tax on consumers. This brings us also to the topic of today's podcast, which is welfare. So this is a measure that should be included in welfare measures, I believe. Mm-hmm. And today, who we have?
So we're gonna pop over now to a recording we made just a day ago, where we were joined, myself and Paco were joined by Katren Rogers, who's a PhD student from the University of Lund in Sweden, and we spoke a little bit about welfare, and yeah, we'll pop over to that footage now. So we're joined now by Katren Rogers, who's from Sydney, Australia, and is a PhD student at the University of Lund in Sweden. Katren also used to work for the New Zealand Treasury as an analyst, and hopefully herself and Paco are going to lead this interesting discussion on welfare. So, Katren, we'll start with you. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background as to where the idea of a welfare state emerged, how it changed, how it has changed coming right up to today in the world?
I suppose that's, the the idea of a welfare state probably emerged a lot later than what we would say the welfare state emerged, right? Usually when we talk about, or when we point to the beginning of the welfare state, we point to the emergence of social insurance schemes in the late 19th and early 20th century. And at that time, I mean, when Bismarck introduced health insurance, he wasn't referring to it as a welfare state, right? So it's not really until, I don't know, Paco, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but after the Second World War, I would say that people start using the term welfare state to talk about those types of benefits.
Yeah, basically it's like it started actually between like in parallel to the concept of warfare state. So the idea, of warfare, so of the entire economy being based on war. In parallel, developed the concept of welfare state. So like the idea was that if you can base the economy and to create to support the war effort, you can at the same time module the economy to support actually a society of welfare, so a society of insurances. There is though also a difference in, is not only a difference in the word, but the word is refers to a different concept again. Like, so insurances was behind the insurances, Bismarckian insurances, was the idea that the state can help. It's basically social peace. The state used insurances to guarantee, in a capitalist society like was Germany in that period, to guarantee to ease social disruption, to guarantee to that workers won't rebel, basically to prevent what was happening in other countries. Let's not remember that this is the period like between like the 18th and 19th century. We had first the French Revolution. We have the 1948 across all Europe. There are a lot of rebellions. There is Marx writing the Communist Manifesto, and then soon later, after World War I, there is the Communist Revolution in Moscow, in Russia. So, like, it's a period where people are really afraid by communism and by rebellion. And this is the origin of the Bismarckian social insurances. It's different when we talk about welfare state. There is a completely different concept which is connected to Second World War II, basically. And the idea behind that is that welfare should be a right of every citizen. So in a way, it's connected with the spread of democracy and universalism, and the idea that the state has the duty to cover, to guarantee to its citizen a decent standard of life throughout the entire his entire life. So to cover, if you have if you lose your job, he will assist you. If someone in your family dies, he will assist you. If you can't afford even a funeral or something like that, the state will assist you. So there are two really different concepts behind this. Sorry.
Okay, that's good. That's good. That's cleared up. So, Katren, again, so moving forward from the establishment and the development of welfare states, what is the situation today in the world? What countries offer these kind of protections as a right? What countries maybe did in the past and have moved away from it? What countries didn't historically engage in this kind of action and now have started to? What's the current setting in the world with regard to welfare?
I mean, I guess I would say that all capitalist countries have some kind of welfare state because it's necessary to deal with the problems of industrialization, urbanization, and kind of the uncertainties of living in an economic system which sort of distributes on the basis of work. And what the welfare state does is that it kind of compensates by creating this other distribution system on the basis of need. So it's necessary to exist in every country, right? But what we see is that there are different styles of welfare states in different countries, and these have changed over time too. So the concept of the welfare state based on cradle to grave that Paco is talking about, is I guess, I mean, you could say like it emerged in Britain, right? with National Health Service or whatever, but over time and in other respects, the British welfare state is a lot more residual or sort of targeted than some of the more expansive welfare states that we have in Northern Europe, in Sweden here, are much more kind of based on universal access and rights.
You touched on it there already in the answer.
Yeah.
What are some of the different models that we see in the world today, and how have they evolved from the original idea of welfare that we were talking about, but going back to post-war and this kind of time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I guess I mean, as you say, I've already sort of identified you have a Scandinavian, very universalistic welfare states. We've talked a little bit about Britain, which in a way is a special case because it's a combination of a universalistic health system together with more residual insurance or transfer systems, right? And then the third main model is the corporatist or conservative welfare states that are more based on this Bismarckian contributory social insurance, and they're less redistributive than social democratic welfare states in Northern Europe. There are also some other kinds of models. Most of the English-speaking world is what we would call liberal or residual, like the UK. Mm-hmm. But in Australia and New Zealand, some people have talked about another model, a radical model of welfare states based on not so much transfers and services, but the regulation of the labour market so that minimum wages are high enough to ensure a reasonable standard of living for families. And that's kind of, it has a lot to do with the way that the strategy of organised labour at the beginning of the 20th century. And that we still see today that there's much more regulation of wages in countries like Australia than for instance, in European welfare states as a means of ensuring a certain standard of living.
Of course.
But in the last, we always have to remember how long ago the 70s were. But since the 1970s, I mean, there's a lot of the story of welfare has been in a way, an expectation that in response to economic crises, there would be a retrenchment of the welfare state, that these benefits would sort of be taken away. I mean, it's not been entirely the case that spending levels have gone down, but certainly what we've seen is more introduction of mixed models, even in Scandinavia, many more private providers being subsidized to deliver services, but also in those liberal countries that are more residual, sort of a greater targeting of transfers. Yeah.
Okay, so keeping our eye firmly on Europe now, let's say, and obviously we fully believe in the idea of more European integration. We think the rules should pretty much apply across the European Union if they apply in one member state or the other. And if we were to introduce the idea of, well, a rough idea of a European welfare state, a couple of questions. First of all, is this an achievable goal? Obviously, as you said, it's an essential part of pretty much any capitalist system. Would we be limiting ourselves to capitalism if we wanted a European welfare state? Could the European welfare state be the end goal in a post-capitalist Europe? And if we can find a model for a welfare state that would apply to Europe, what would the model look like? Or what model would be most likely to be successful in Europe? The more universal or the more residual or some sort of a hybrid system like you see in some countries?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it's hard to think about a European welfare state and a post-capitalist welfare state. Because to have a welfare state, you need a state, mm-hmm. and Europe is not a state, presently anyway. So that's one side, and then the other is, yeah, that the welfare state, as I've talked about, is distinctly, I mean, it's an artifact of capitalism. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that the concept of welfare and the idea that welfare should be publicly insured mm-hmm. is capitalist. It doesn't have to be, right? Mm-hmm. So in a non-capitalist society, if you had a distribution system that was not based on the sale of labor, there would be no need for social insurances or these types of kind of, the collectivization of savings to make sure that when you're sick or retired that you're looked after. You wouldn't need those types of things, right? But having a distribution system based on need is very much in line with the concept of, public responsibility for the provision of welfare, right? And I suppose if I was to think about what does a European welfare system or a sort
Better
of
term.
look like,
because actually with welfare state, sorry, small parenthesis, but with welfare state, when we use the word welfare state, we refer to a precise model, which is what Katren was saying, the Scandinavia from cradle to grave. So this idea of universal welfare state.
Oh, okay.
Welfare system, like for example, a corporate system is a welfare system rather than a welfare state.
Okay, that's my mistake. So for using the
No.
So let's forget the idea of a European
academic.
This is it.
I think, and I think I would disagree. Like, maybe not with the academic point, but the people use the word welfare state also to describe how welfare is provided for in Australia or in Germany or or in the US as well. People talk about it, an American welfare state too. So in the more general sense, we can talk about varieties of welfare state. Even if what you're thinking of is kind of the more universalistic Scandinavian model, right?
Okay, this is my supervisor. Welfare state is only the Scandinavian one. Like, be careful.
Okay.
Pedro. So if I can jump in on this anyway, like, because I think though the different models are quite interesting, also in this discussion about a possible European welfare system, in the sense that the idea of a European welfare system or welfare state, actually you can use the word here, is not new. There are discussions about this from the 40s, from 1948, immediately after the first Den Haag Congress, which is called also Congress of Europe, is when they sort of think about European integration. And I think it entrenches a lot with the discussion about two different models of European integration. One, which was a Europe of nations, which is mainly, Churchill was the one championing this model. So the idea that within a sort of European government, you would have maintained those national governments, so national sovereignty and national independence. The other idea was that of a federal Europe from the beginning. So the idea of creating immediately from the start a European federal government, which was like about the federalism, was more left-wing, of course, as an idea, because it involved like many, like Altiero Spinelli, who was actually part of the Communist Party in Italy, but also like because it implied also indeed the creation of a European welfare system. So one unique system rather than having different models from the beginning for the entire Europe. And in my vision, this is a fundamental passage because the idea there, the model after World War II was the Beveridge Report, which is this British model, which is what we were discussing. So this universal welfare system where every citizen would have been, every citizen, not like if you're a worker, not if you lose your job, but every citizen, not on the basis of your income, every citizen throughout the course of their life are guaranteed social rights. And I think this discussion is particularly interesting if we talk about the future, because with the emergence of a lot of new phenomena, like could be mass unemployment due, for example, to automatization and robotization of jobs, rather than, for example, what we are seeing now with coronavirus, with a lot of people needing care, like from the state, like necessarily, like. So I think it's a really interesting concept to recover, because then this was actually in the process of European integration completely lost, and actually the Bismarckian corporatist model based on work occupation became the main European model, like the German, Italian, French. Just to be clear, why Italy and Spain are actually a mix because they have universal healthcare, but the insurance system is based on the Bismarckian traditional.
Paco, a question for you. And again, it's a question. I'm not entirely sure, but you're saying that the push then went towards the more corporate model, let's say. Would it be fair to say that a big impact in that push was due to the relationship countries would have had to their historical monarchies? You know what I mean? As you say, some countries who had trust in their monarchies, like Scandinavian countries, for example, it was easier to move to a more universal approach because they were more trusting of the government to handle more aspects of their life. Whereas in other countries, Ireland, for example, where in Ireland they broke away from, obviously it was the British monarchy, there's a massive distrust there and a distrust in the government in general. It's more difficult to apply that system. Do you see that historical context as still relevant today? Did it have a big impact at the time, and would it have an impact these days?
So, I mean, there might be, and then perhaps Katren knows more about this, being a Swedish living in Sweden right now. I don't know about Ireland, the case of Ireland. I think in this case, as far as we are talking between universalist and corporatist system, what really makes the difference a little bit is like a tradition. Like, so like, for example, in Germany, like the corporatist system recovers the idea of the corporation of labor. So like medieval idea where, you know, like different people in a sector would associate together and sort of enact some forms of insurance or whatever, like, or even regulate prices and make some laws like for the category. So it's the idea of a sort of bisector solidarity. Like, so let's say all the I don't know, workers of steel, coal and steel, just to make an example, which is the origin of the European model, not the coal and steel community, you would make some rules for that sector. And that is really where this idea of corporatist welfare comes out. The universalist is actually way more recent. Like, again, it originates more with the in the let's say atmosphere of the Keynesian revolution. So the idea that the state needs to intervene into economy, and so it's a way of actually again, it's based more like, so Keynes realizes parts of his idea looking at Nazi Germany, looking at communist Russia. It's a way of intervening in the economy without losing, as Katren was saying, the capitalist system. So also the free market, also the freedom. So it's a bit of a third way between American, at that point, hypercapitalism, or British hypercapitalism before the 40s, 1940s, and the communist sort of direct control of the economy. And again, Katren might know more about the monarchies. I'm not a big fan of monarchies in general. I'm for to cut.
I don't think any of us are back though.
I suppose I think it has less to do with the history of monarchies and more to do with the way that the masses who were enfranchised in the late 19th century, if they were men, and early 20th century or mid 20th century, even if they were women, the way that they were organized by institutional politics and by the political parties that became sort of influential. So in corporatist systems, the mass parties were the Christian democratic parties, which had an interest in those existing corporatist systems, because of the value of voluntary organizations in, Catholic social doctrine, etc. But yeah, in countries like Scandinavia, where the mass parties were social democratic parties that were interested in, promoting equal rights and also interested in the emancipation of the individual from organizations like the family or whatever, that was sort of more interested in individualism and equality. In those countries where the masses were, voting for social democratic parties, then the more universal models kind of became expanded and became dominant, as Paco says, much later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's clearer now. So keeping that in mind, and again, moving back to this idea of, well, the idea we would all love, if we had a European welfare system, how do we appreciate, as you were saying, the the parties that had the power and the groups that had power and influence at the time were the ones who dictated what happened, essentially. How do we take people and groups, political parties and other groups from 27 different countries and find a common system which everyone, well, we can all acknowledge that it's a system that is there for the benefit of everyone, but how do you bring everyone's ideas and views of what's good for them together and establish a system like this in Europe, or at least attempt to, or at least find the right model that could apply?
Who's this for? Oh.
This is a question for both of you.
Okay, I can start. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves why. Like, do we need a European welfare system? So let's start from that, like, because I think that is a fundamental question. Like, so why, like, we have welfare systems in Europe right now? Why do we need a European centralized system? Do we need it? To me, the answer is yes, and is clear if you look at a series of phenomena which are happening in Europe right now. First of all, people don't live anymore in one country. They live in different countries, perhaps in different countries in the same year. The economy in many ways, like, we have a generation of European who is already European rather than Italian, rather than English, German, or whatever. They're already living in a Europe which is integrated in certain forms. Furthermore, I believe, like, during the process of globalization, this has to do also with the process of globalization. If we have witnessed the phenomenon where, like, if a state enacts welfare measures which are too strong, so for example, this will of course bring the cost of labor up, because, like, putting welfare measure means that you need to pay a part of the wage for the workers to pay the welfare. And if you have national welfare systems, you will have this phenomenon which we have been witnessing of competition between one nation and the other. So, like, if in a nation which has less welfare measures, the cost of labor is lower, investor might invest in that nation rather than in another nation. And so what happens is this process where countries where the labor costs less, and so workers have less rights, are becoming more capitalistically good for an investment. And so you can't anymore impose, I believe, welfare measure at a national level. Again, a concrete example, in Italy, perhaps the cost of labor is too high. So what happened in the 1990s, early 2000s, is a lot of people started to, Italian people, open companies in Romania, where you had way less rights for the labor, for the workers. But that, of course, is a really bad and process, like, where, like, workers are losing rights. I believe the minimum thing is right now you need a European coordination to guarantee that all the European citizens, and it's different when you talk about Europe, because of course it's like as an aggregate is probably the first economy in the world. So if the entire European Union imposes certain measures, then will be not only a model for other countries, but also will be capable of imposing it continent wide. That's my answer. But Katren probably disagrees with it. Like, I see the problems that there are in this process.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I agree that in order for there to be coordination between all of the countries in Europe, then the European Union, well, one way of having that would be for the European Union to be the sovereign, be the state in the welfare state, right? Because in order for any kind of welfare system to have some kind of legitimacy and to work for citizens, it needs to be negotiated democratically. And so if we're going to have the same system for all of Europe, then that negotiation has to occur at the level of a European polity. So that is, I would see, like, one solution to a coordinated and having the same type of welfare system in all of Europe. But the other way is much more difficult politically, in a way, I think, would be that national governments would have to impose the same measures in all countries, but measures that, for example, in Sweden, might not really be in the interests of Swedish citizens and Swedish voters. They might be actually more for the benefit of someone on the other side of Europe. And for that to happen, I mean, it's just difficult for a national politician to make that decision, right? But at the same time, I mean, I think in order for that to happen, or in order for the European Union to become, to become a sovereign, for the European Parliament to have that kind of power, both of those ways of having a European welfare system require some kind of, the building of a coalition throughout Europe for a European identity, for people, citizens, voters, but citizens in all of Europe to sort of feel part of all of Europe and feel empathy with people on the other side of the continent, for whom these policies will be beneficial, if not, for themselves. So I think they're both hard, and I don't really know which one is more unlikely. So I'm not, yeah.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it's hard to find that.
No, sorry.
No, just a quick, just saying, I completely agree. It's very difficult to find the balance of, for example, someone from a Northern European country saying, okay, this is going to damage me personally this much, but it might bring up someone in Eastern Europe's life this much. That's what we need to find, and that common feeling hasn't been found in Europe yet. We see it a lot with a lot of people we talk to and a lot of our colleagues, but that general feeling doesn't seem to be everywhere yet, which is a massive problem when we're trying to get these cooperative measures introduced. Yeah. Definitely.
No, I agree. I mean, it's of course a really complicated question, and especially there is also a generational component, I find, where younger people are more perhaps open to consider the idea of a Europe, while older generation are still more attached to the national model, sort of, to a national identity. But the thing is that in many ways, in my opinion, the European Union is already a state, and especially if we consider at least the euro area. You have a unique currency, you have economic policies which are dictated by central authorities, and a lot of things you need to respect. So in a way, okay, let's for now talk about the euro area, because it's a different question, the euro area probably, and the entire EU. But you already, in many ways, you are already working as a state. Is a probably really neoliberal conception of a state, where the economy somehow will solve the problems without a political authority on it. But is a state in the way it's working. And in the same way as a state works, if Northern Italy is really rich, Southern Italy is poor. But it's not just because Northern Italy is rich and Southern Italy is poor. It's also because Northern Italy exploits the fact that it's one country only to become richer. And it's the economies are interrelated. So Southern Italy doesn't grow as much because Northern products are cheaper, because everything in terms of production is cheaper in the North. And so for the South has been really difficult historically to develop. The same happens once you have a unique currency in a system of countries. So now Germany has been doing great, economically in the past, apart that now also Germany is having some flexion, but in the past 30 years, let's say, was the country doing better. But of course, that is also because it's exploiting the entire system of the euro area to, its economy is working on all of it. If before, let's say, a Spanish car could compete with the German car because it was way cheaper, because then pesos and Deutschmark had a really different weight. So as in the international market, a Spanish car could have been way cheaper of the German, not the same quality, but really cheap. And they could have a competition. Now with the euro, the cost of production is really similar. And so all of a sudden, all the Spanish industries find really difficult to compete with the German ones. And so you definitely need, I think, mechanism of redistribution at the European level, at least in the euro areas. Otherwise, it won't simply work, as it wouldn't work at the national level, because every nation has mechanism of redistribution between one region and the other. Richer region, for the nation to work, richer region needs to transfer part of the money to the poorest region.
Yeah, you've touched on one of the main issues there in the EU nowadays, I think, and we've seen it not just in relation to these kind of issues we're talking about of welfare and the economy, but the economic nature of the EU has gone so far past the political power and the political influence and the political abilities of the EU, and it's very difficult to bridge that gap. You know, everything in the EU has become so tightly linked, all the member states. Even if we look at the issue again of we've been talking about it for weeks, the rule of law, and with Poland and Hungary continuing to veto the recovery plan because they disagree with the clause that stipulates they must adhere to the rule of law. And there's no mechanism to get around that veto at the moment. You know, it's just this is another example of the economic nature of the EU being prioritized and being stronger and having gone so far past the political side of things that it seems it's very difficult to try and come up with ideas now as to how we catch up politically. You know what I mean? As you said, the Eurozone now it's really become a Eurozone where everything is, as you say, the price is the same in Germany or Spain or wherever it may be. Mm-hmm. So again, more easy questions for you guys. How are we going to bridge this gap?
It's certainly difficult, and I'll let Katren conclude, but I think it starts from what Katren was saying, like from building an identity, a new, which is a little bit also what Arbury Road now is trying to do, a new progressive identity in Europe, which passes, in my opinion, through also the idea of that we can discuss on the different model, we can discuss on how, as Katren was saying, you reach a sort of homogeneity of welfare at the European level, but passes through the idea that we need a sort of welfare in all European system, a similar welfare, and we need redistribution Europe-wide, and not only because it makes sense economically. I think it definitely makes sense economically, is the right thing to do also economically, because, you know, the GDP of the entire European Union, you know, if you find the way to make Southern Italy as rich as Northern Italy, like Italy would become one of the richest countries in the world. But it's not only economically, but it's also the right thing to do morally and ethically. Like, I mean, is the European Union has the resources, has the intelligence, has the everything that needs to guarantee to everyone a really good standard of life. And I think this is the kind of society I want to live in, and we should want to live in.
Absolutely. Katren, anything to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think Paco kind of summarized my thoughts well, that I think a European identity is the foundation of how you get kind of democratic buy-in into that system, right? Because in order for it to be legitimate, citizens all across Europe need to feel like they're part of the same group as other Europeans. Because if you're looking at other countries and other citizens as someone that you're in competition with, you're very unlikely to support policies that redistribute to them, right? Especially if I'm not affected by the kind of bad consequences of poor redistribution that are going on. So, for example, crime rates in Spain don't affect me very much in Sweden, right? So if I'm not affected by the externalities of not having a good redistributive system across Europe, then I need to buy into that I'm in the same group as those people in Spain, that I have some affection for those people, and I don't see myself as in competition with them. So that's why I think that a European identity is key to whatever institutional path leads this to happening.
Fantastic. Katren, thanks a million.
So that was us speaking to Katren Rogers just a day ago about welfare. I'm sure, well, I hope you enjoyed it as much as we do. Yeah. That brings this first episode of EU and Me to an end. So thanks again to Katren Rogers, our first guest. Yeah. And thanks to everyone for watching, and stay tuned for more.
Stay tuned. Next week we should have, if everything goes well, environment. So we'll talk about the climate crisis.
Some environmental experts.
Really central topic to the future of all of us. So I'll see you next week.
Bye bye.
Ciao.